Hello, everyone, and welcome to a live podcast recording of Travel Trends here in Toronto. I am thrilled to be joined by Philip Hancock, the Chief Commercial Officer of Mint Payments. Phil, welcome to Travel Trends. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Dan. It is fantastic to be here in Toronto. It's great to meet you. Very well known in the industry, and it's really good to speak to you about travel, speak to you about Mint, and talk to the travel industry in Canada.
Terrific. No, it's fantastic to have you here. I'm so glad that we were able to sit down in person like this because obviously Mint Payments launching in Canada is a significant development. And so let's actually start there. And just to give our listeners an overview of Mint Payments, what you guys do.
Okay, we are basically a payment service provider. So we provide, we talk about three parts of our business. We talk about collect, we talk about safeguard, and we talk about send. So on the collect side, quite traditional, we help our travel merchants with taking payment from their customers. Traditionally, that's credit card. We also do other payment methods, pay by bank and buy now, pay laters. We have a safeguard product, which is called Mint Protect, which maybe we'll talk about later. And then we help with supplier payments, which is a big side. So we're a payment service provider, 100% focused on the travel industry.
That's great. And obviously people heard from the introduction, Mint's been around since 2007. And it's quite staggering when I got to know a bit more about Mint is that you're doing 3.5 billion in annual transaction volume, got more than 2,000 merchants. So this is a very sizable business that's been around for nearly 20 years. And here you are now entering the Canadian market. So it's great to have you with us. And obviously Toronto, this is home for me. And this is the commercial hub for business in Canada. Tell everyone what brings you to Canada and why you've decided to focus on this market.
Yeah, so Mint's been around that long, but I think we've really been focused on the travel sector since around 2019. Good timing for us. We really kind of doubled down on the travel sector. So we had a couple of quiet years at the start, but we're focused. We're based in Sydney. We have a lot of customers in the Australian market. We moved into New Zealand market in about 2022, and we've always had the aspiration to grow globally. Last year we opened in the UK, and we have a sizable team based in London, and we're looking for the next step. And Canada was, we looked at a few places, but was really for us the obvious choice. The travel industries are similar, not exactly the same. There's obviously a lot of kind of cultural sharing, business and wider. And look, we just like Canada, to be honest.
Yeah, and there's many reasons why I completely agree with you. One thing I actually wanted just to address at the beginning is you have such a lovely English accent, not an Australian accent. Both accents are great, but you are from the UK originally.
I am.
And so for both of us, obviously, I was born in the UK, as were you, and then you have been living in Australia for more than 25 years. I lived in Australia, as I mentioned to you before we got a chance to start recording, and I love Australia. And these are my favorite markets: the UK, Australia, and Canada. Half of our listeners, of course, are in the US, and obviously that's a massive market and drives a lot of the global travel business. But a lot of things we're going to be talking about here on the podcast is the Canadian market and why it's having a moment. And, as we're recording this, the Rendezvous Conference has been on here in Toronto, Toronto Tech Week. And, you're here in a very kind of monumental week for Canadian tourism. And so it's a perfect time for you to be here to understand how significant the Canadian tourism market is. But before we get into all of that, I think it would be interesting for our listeners to understand your backstory and how you got into this space, because you actually, you've got your MBA, you're very smart, and you've obviously achieved a lot, but you also have a specific background in the travel industry. So help our listeners understand a little bit about who Phil is and how you ended up at Mint Payments.
Yeah, I'm travel. I straight out of uni, got a job in a travel agency. I was a travel agent for 2 to 3 years. I was not a great travel agent for 2 to 3 years. I worked in leisure travel, a bit of corporate. That was in the UK, and then working in the airline space. Moved over to Sydney in 2000. Stayed in travel, worked in travel tech. So I've kind of done all four corners of the industry. Worked GDS, worked airlines, Expedia, hotel beds, and how I came into Mint. It was COVID. I think this was where I landed up. I was launching again at good timing an OTA in the Australian market into 2019. So I was looking for a travel specialist payment provider. And I was talking to Mint, talking to the CEO, Alex. And when we decided not to progress that online travel agency, they asked me to join the team there, and I have been there ever since. And, it's interesting. Though I am travel, payments has really I've caught the bug. and I understand the importance of it, and it's strangely enjoyable.
Well, and the interesting thing, I mean, I think the payments sector is probably the most misunderstood and least appreciated side of the travel industry. But actually, it's where a lot of the conversions, there's so many benefits to really understanding payments in terms of not only increasing conversions, but also cash flow, paying suppliers. And so this is a conversation that most travel companies need to be having to reevaluate who their partners are and making big decisions around their profitability of their business and merchants. And so this, for me, it was a spotlight episode I was really keen to have for all of those reasons. And I want to make sure that over the course of our conversation together, we cover a lot of those topics that would be of great interest to our listeners to better understand the payment space, understand what's unique about Mint payments. I was speaking to my colleague about this beforehand, and he was highlighting to me about a lot of the work that Mint has done to really improve operational efficiency and achieve some big gains on the back end side. And I want to make sure that we clarify from your vantage point what that all means. But in terms of Mint being in the travel space and really specializing in travel, take us through a little bit of that journey in the last 4 or 5 years, because there is an interesting parallel, not only in terms of travel trends starting post-pandemic, but also customer behavior changing substantially post-pandemic. And people used to put 100% payment up front. Now they like to do part payments. They like to put deposits down. And people have realized the value of money because, as you well know, prior to the pandemic, interest rates were at an all-time low. And then all of a sudden interest rates, shot through the roof, and people started to realize the value of money. And also, they also got, unfortunately, burned by some travel brands during the pandemic that wouldn't refund. And so this industry has been under a lot more scrutiny. I know you guys do virtual credit cards and how you pay suppliers and trying to make sure that, that everyone's going to get paid in the right order. So this area has gone through a massive amount of change. So I would actually say you joined the industry at the right time, because it was actually, on the other side of the pandemic as travel came back in a big way. So tell us about the last few years in travel for Mint payments and really what makes your platform unique.
Yeah, without dwelling too much on the COVID, I think we've all heard enough about that. But you're right. It's made some significant changes to the industry. I think what I've recognised, and I'm kind of strangely passionate about payments and strangely passionate about payments in travel, is that how important it is to all the way through the customer journey. It's not just the bit at the end where you give the money after the service has been provided. It's a differentiator on the service that you provide. Someone said to me at a travel agent the other day, being quite frank, he said, to be honest, a lot of the time I'm selling the same thing on the same seats on the same plane to the same place as the other guy. And what differentiates me is my service, and how people pay is a large part of that. And something we probably in the travel sector forget is that customers are making large purchases, emotional purchases. There's a trust issue that they're buying something they can't feel, they can't touch. It might just be that annual vacation, which is hard earned. It might be the bucket list purchase, but when they're passing over $10,000-$20,000 sometimes, how they pay and that whether there's friction or whether they feel uncomfortable is incredibly important. So we really, we're in payments, but we do try to express on our customers and our partners that it is more than just a bit of plumbing, a bit of wiring at the back about the money. And I think, if we look at what a travel agent, travel consultant does, it's like a third of the time is spent making payments, taking payments, organising payments, reconciling a payment. And that's time that could be spent growing the business, dealing with our customers. And it's not fun work. It's not the fun bit of the industry. You're not sitting there and talking to someone about, organising their honeymoon or sending the parents away to Europe. We're talking about just trying to get that bank rec happening.
Yeah.
So that's where we really try to add value.
Well, and just to dive into that a bit in a bit more detail, because as our listeners, travel agencies, travel advisors, tour operators that are listening to this, obviously they're familiar with online payments, of course, but one of the things that's also unique about Mint and what you provide is in-person payments. You guys obviously do electronic fund transfers. You do the virtual cards as well. And then one of the things that is the side of the business we don't like to talk about is chargebacks and fraud and those issues as well. And I know you guys have implemented Mint Protect, and you've got a big focus on B2B. And so just along those lines, as far as what are the reasons that already, given that you are in Australia, New Zealand, and you launched in the UK, And now, obviously, we'll talk about Canada in a bit more detail. But given your current offering in those markets, what are the things that you have seen that are really resonating with travel companies that are choosing Mint, and what is the kind of the standout features or functionality that is seeing people choose you over what else is in the marketplace?
I think there's probably kind of three main things that bring people to Mint. The first one is just the service and the commercials. We're always highly competitive. We know that there is, it's a low margin business. Taking that depends on the market you're in, somewhere between 0.5%, 1.5%, 2-3% is a significant part of the revenue of the business. So we need to keep that in mind. Understanding the business is incredibly important. Knowing the difference between a P&R and a ticketing time limit and those points, you generally won't get that from your add-ins and your Barclay cards. And then technology is a key point. We integrate a lot, so we will actually work to integrate with mid-offices, supplier ResTech, and because that's key. There's too much what I often call the swivel chair API, where people put them out, they're looking at one computer and then they're re-entering somewhere else. That's where all the inefficiencies and the accuracy and even fraud sometimes. So having those integrations with the workflows and with the business systems is key. And then it's just new products. They're looking to bring into the market. They want buy now, pay later. They want pay by bank, customer tracking, all just things like doing your Amex pay by points, and having that and really understanding what motivates a travel buyer is key.
Well, it's one of the things that stood out to me, and one of the reasons I was keen to have this conversation with you is that I know that the customer experience is what Mint Payments is primarily focused on. And obviously this is an area that, many companies talk about that, but when you look at existing travel brands, and I work with quite a few, especially on the advisory side of the business, that they have gone with whoever their bank had recommended as their payment solution provider. So it wasn't something that was given a lot of thought up front. And it's not until they have an issue or they realize there's certain things they can't reconcile that they need to start to look for a provider that really understands the travel industry. And so this is a huge vertical. Obviously, it's the third largest industry globally. The travel industry, more than 1 out of 10 people work in this industry in Canada and globally, and it's expected to increase to 12 to 15% over the next several years as more people not only embrace travel and more people work in our industry. And so I think this whole industry itself is still poised for a lot of evolution on the payment side. And so you want to find someone that specializes in travel. But let's talk a bit about the Canadian market, because I'm very keen to know, as you have success in the markets you're operating in, remind us again what actually kind of inspired the move into Canada. And I have a few thoughts on that. But yeah, what motivated the team to realize why Canada, why now?
I think there's some of it is more obvious. So we're an English-speaking country. Largely, we've got a really similar size. We're about the same population. We've got a similar demographics. So we're migrant countries. So there's a lot of kind of similarities. Our practices are pretty much the same to a large degree, and our industries cross over. There's a lot of people who've worked in the Canadian industry, who've worked in the Australian industry. The kind of clients we work with, the big suppliers, are evident in both. There's a lot of Australian companies here and Canadian companies in Australia. But I think the other point is we've brought to those markets, Australia, but then the UK, which is probably going to be our biggest market within a year or two. Solutions to problems that we've had and we've addressed, and we feel that are still here, that we can bring. And we're not going to provide a solution to every problem there. We think Mint has some strong value that can work in the Canadian market.
And the one thing I will highlight for all of our listeners, and I think this is really important, especially for our American listeners that are looking to market to Canadian consumers, if you break down population demographics, the Canadian population is about a 10th, and Australia is about a 15th when we look at the size of the market. So there's more in terms of population. There's more Canadians than there are Australians, and there's nearly 10 times as many Americans. But the interesting thing for both Australians and Canadians is that we massively punch above our weight when it comes to travel.
Yeah.
And so, the American market may be 10 times the population, but it's more like only 4 times the market size. So when you're thinking about investing in North America, really 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 bookings that you're expecting to get is going to come from Canada. And it's very similar. In Australia is even a higher percentage, just given the fact that Australians are, they carry passports and they travel internationally and they're avid travelers. As anyone who travels knows, you're going to meet Australians when you go. You're going to meet Kiwis, of course, from New Zealand, and Brits are great travelers too. And so there's a real commonality, I think, between those countries. But as we talk about Canada, given the influence of the U.S., and this is what I think is kind of unique about the Canadian market, is that we have the British heritage and roots. So you're absolutely right about those commonalities, being part of the Commonwealth and laws and government and those things. However, we are very influenced by the American market and the American customer experience. Americans will tend to pay with multiple credit cards. There are certain things that are really unique about the American market. And I've seen this from my time working in travel agencies. Americans will call in and say, put $500 on this, put $1,500 on that. Most Canadians are more conservative by nature. They'll typically choose one payment method. But I'm very curious, in the work that you did preparing for launching in Canada, what are some of the things that you've noticed that are different about the Canadian market from where you operate today?
Yeah, and I want to be really careful as a British guy who's lived most of his career in Australia, now coming into Canada, coming also as an expert in Canada, because I'm not, but we're learning quickly. Yes, Canada is. It's a hybrid in many ways. So there's a lot of cultural things that are similar, but the business and the payment kind of market is very much influenced by the US, and it's most likely we will be getting business from the US, and we are already in the US. We have operations there, and we have customers there. I think probably the key difference is the payment flow. The fact that a large number of agents actually don't even take any payment directly, or a large payment goes to the supplier and it's coming back on commission. Now that's a traditional, I would say legacy, but it's a more traditional way of the travel industry working. It's certainly the way it used to work in Australia, it used to work in the UK. They've changed. The agency sector has taken more control of payment, is now the merchant of record or is the primary payment point for the majority, in leisure at least, of travel. And I think, so that's surprising. I knew that was the case in the US. I assumed it was the case in Canada. We've been learning, not just this week, but over the last year or so, about how dominant that is. But I think I think it's changing. I think there's an impetus for that to change, and we work with both. So that's probably the key change for us, or the key difference, sorry.
Phil, it's interesting what you were saying there about the differences between the Australian market, the Canadian market, and specifically this merchant of record when it comes to who controls the payment process. And in Australia, certainly the merchant of record is the travel agency that takes the booking. Over here, you have the suppliers, as we were talking about, that you end up booking directly with. They're the merchant of record. So one of the things I'm keen to know, as you look at the Canadian market, and you see what happens in other markets, do you think that merchant of record is going to be something that changes here in the next few years?
I do, and let's be clear. I mean, that has evolved. It largely came out of the UK, and they're very much a similar situation. I think we need to look at what the benefits are of being the merchant of record. It allows you to, firstly, it gives you control of the money. I mean, it's in your hand rather than in your suppliers, and you're not waiting for commissions to be paid. You're not always chasing that. But it also gives you the ability to package and bring that whole experience together. So you can sell multiple suppliers, and you're still the primary conduit or the primary contact for that customer. Let's be honest, all agents they're all slightly concerned that they're going to lose that customer to the supplier. And once they've got that card and once they've got those customer details, it's all kind of inevitable. They're going to have a lot more contact with your customer. So being a merchant of the record allows you to have keep that primary relationship, bring it all together. Customers, to be honest, they don't want to make 5 payments if they don't have to. If they've made the choice to deal with you, they kind of want to pay you and they want to deal with you if there's a problem. So it's taking slightly up the food chain. It's allowing you to provide a greater service to your customers. And I think long term that will happen. And there's certainly agents I'm speaking to in Canada that want to go that route and to focus more on becoming the merchant of record rather than just a supplier conduit.
Are there any other standouts so far for you as you are rolling out to Canadian clients, given that you do have U.S. clients as well, that has stood out to you that is particularly unique about the Canadian experience?
No, not. I think that's probably the driver. I think destinations are different. purchase. I mean, we have a lot more cruise, I think, out of Australia potentially than anywhere in the world. In fact, we're the highest buyers of cruise per capita anywhere in the world. But I think obviously there is a more of a US influence on destination and kind of travel choice. But yeah, I mean, I think there's more in common than different. But we've got to be mindful of those small differences.
Yeah, the one thing I'll highlight, and I'll say this for you, being a Canadian living in this market, is that, and there's an interesting bit of history here, of course, because the United Empire loyalists, the ones that actually stayed loyal to the crown, that formed Canada, we have this difference in the U.S. It was peace, order, and good government versus life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. And so Canadians, by definition, are typically a little bit more conservative, and therefore they're a little more risk adverse. And so they're much more of the late majority in terms of once you get into a market, there's a trust level and they have confidence, then Americans, the late majority is a herd that then moves in your direction. So this is one of the things that's exciting about the Canadian market is that once you get traction, once you get the adoption, it's a much more significant growth over time. But Canadians need to know that their concerns are going to be addressed. And some of the things that Canadian travel companies, we learn from the U.S., is where they will take a more innovative approach to things like cancel for any reason, or even the payment plans you described, is that there'll be more experimentation in a market like the U.S. And once you find something that works, all of a sudden then Canadians will latch onto it as well. And then it will then hit this market. So on that topic, one of the things I wanted to make sure that we discussed is some of the opportunities for travel companies that are looking at their payment provider. And this is kind of opening up the question of, who do they currently work with? What are the things they need to be aware of? And that's where I'd love to get your take to help kind of educate and inform the Canadian travel industry about either kind of missed opportunities they may not be realizing at the moment, ways that they could increase conversions. So in terms of the whole payments experience, tell us a little bit some of the things that will help influence conversion, develop more trust, and ultimately one of the things that most travel companies are looking to is keep people coming back and lifetime customer value. What are some of the things that Mint Payments or the payment decision can really influence?
Yeah, good question. I think, but coming back to that period about the difference in the US and Canada, I think that is important. But I think Australia fits more in the Canadian experience, but maybe a little bit more innovative. But historically, I'm not sure it's a cultural thing. It's just probably what's happening in the business. And one thing we have seen, and working in the UK over the last year, there's a lot more diversity in payment methods that's going. So we'll see a lot less card penetration in many markets, where either just standard bank transfer that's is used to a high degree, but new products. Obviously, the wallets are important. I mean, here is everywhere, the Google Pays and Apple Pays. But the pay by bank is becoming a big mover in globally. Part of that's a reaction around credit card fees and merchant service fees. In some markets, Australia's just moving away from surcharging, that's driven a lot of people who are happy to spend $25,000 on a cruise, but don't want to spend $100 on a credit card fee. They'll use just a bank transfer. But the pay IDs, the pay by banks are becoming more prevalent. The buy now pay later schemes. I suppose when I first started looking at buy now pay later, I looked at them as credit of, if you need to do an afterpay or etc. Are you really our type of customer? But there is a generation that now are using those tools as their credit cards. It's the method of choice. And we have a partner, Zip, in Australia and the US, which you can use up to $20,000 to use. So I think the different options there. And people are paying later, and they want to pay quicker. It's more innovative. It's faster. But yeah, it's an interesting space.
So one thing I'm keen to ask you along these lines, and when I was at the Travel Corporation, and I was obviously there for many years, one of the things we were always trying to improve upon is the online booking process and the different payment options. And so there was a big focus towards increasing the number of ways that people could pay. And so obviously that was Apple Pay, Alipay, but it also was the buy now, pay later. One of the things we also realized, though, is that travelers can get overwhelmed. So you give them all these options. And and again, the reason I ask this question is because I'm keen for our listeners to be able to glean some of those benefits from your perspective and what you've seen. We know travelers want more flexibility. So they want to have options to do pay by bank or credit card. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't overwhelm the traveler when they're all of a sudden there's so many different options and they're trying to figure out, wait a second, is it better to do a buy now, pay later? Is that a better payment plan? Is that like ultimately better for me and my financial situation? How do you help travelers navigate that so it's easy for them and it helps increase conversion, not negatively impact it?
I mean, a large part of that's about the UI, about the user experience, about where you put that in the payment flow. But I think that the key is really understanding your demographic, your customer base. I mean, and travel companies are generally really good at that. So, we'll speak to companies that don't want buy now, pay later, but do want Amex Pay by Points, or they do want Pay ID. So, I mean, the number one thing is know your customers, speak to them, and be responsive. If people are saying, asking for something, then obviously you want to look at your competitors. And you're right, don't overwhelm. So don't offer the 5 different options. Ideally, you let people know what options are available even before they start the payment journey, if it's an online experience or if it's just a checkout experience, so they can come ready with how they want to pay. So you give them that information up front, and you position the workflow in often the way you want them to pay. So if you do want to use a non-card payment because it's more cost effective for you as a merchant, then don't bury it down the bottom after you've got Visa and MasterCard up front, and then there's there. So you need to it's user experience and UI. I think it's really important.
Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you is where you're seeing the growth, because it's one thing when all of a sudden there's a realization, well, we need Apple Pay because 2% are now using Apple Pay, but sometimes we rush to do things when it's like 0.001% and it doesn't necessarily move the needle. So what I wanted to ask you, as far as the various payment methods that you've highlighted, what is growing fastest? And the one thing I just want to add to this for our listeners that I found this really fascinating, Douglas Quinby, who runs Arrival, when he was showing some of the stats of payments as it relates to the different demographics, the younger generation, who we knew certainly with Kentucky and those brands, were more likely to choose part payments because they could pay over time. And this had been a longstanding option for payments, so that you could essentially a layaway plan. What was interesting, though, is that we've shifted between paying before your trip gradually to now actually taking the trip and paying gradually afterwards. But the amazing stat that he shared that really shook me was the Coachella. He used the example of Coachella, and obviously it's an incredible music festival in California. The tickets can be upwards of $1,500 or $2,000 or more if you're booking them late. And it was nearly 70% of the people that booked tickets did a payment plan.
Yep.
Because it makes sense when you think about someone in the young their early 20s or in their 20s, they're actually going to make sure they go to Coachella, but they don't necessarily have $2,000 now to buy that ticket. So that to me stood out of, if you're not offering a buy now pay later plan, you're going to miss 70% of the market opportunity. So that's what I'm trying to share with our audience. So I'd love to hear from your vantage point, what are the most fastest growing forms of payment?
I want to clarify that. I think credit card is still the dominant form of payment, and it's in our market, in different markets, it's growing. To a certain extent, and that all depends on things like surcharging and use. But if we come back to the buy now pay later, I think we need to. And I had this thought, and I was thinking, well, it's a credit product. It's people who can't afford. You hear the stories of predatory lending and young people putting the food budget on buy now pay later. I mean, that's bad. But what I failed to realize at the time was it's not that they need the credit. It's just their form of payment. They just revolving payment in the same way as I don't really need the credit that I get on my credit card, but I use a credit card as a form of payment.
Right.
It's that point. So when it comes to that demographic skew, some of it, yes, might be they don't have a credit card, so this is their option. But a lot of it's just, this is how I like to pay, and I put it on that, and that's my habit. We're creatures of habit.
Yeah, that's interesting. So another thing I want to explore with you, especially as it relates to the Canadian market, is risk, and obviously the cancellations, disputes, these things that it's not until they come up, and even this concept of merchant of record. Well, who is the merchant of record? And I've highlighted this before, is that everyone wants to be the merchant of record until there's a problem, and then all of a sudden it's like. So one of the things I know you've introduced is Mint Protect. Tell us a little bit about the importance of that, how it works in practice, and how how important these types of options are becoming for travelers.
Yeah, I think risk, and let's just say the word chargeback is something that we need to surface and we need to talk about probably more, particularly in times like now where there's a lot of cancellations happening, and being the merchant of record is got a lot of benefits for cash flow and for control and supplier relationships. But there is a flip side to that. You can get a chargeback where a customer decides that they don't want to pay for some reason. The service they've got delivered doesn't meet their need, and we all know that the customer advocacy, to put it one way, is becoming stronger, and so we're seeing an increase in chargebacks in travel. Now, the Australian market where we launched Mint Protect didn't really have chargebacks. They just didn't happen, but it is really starting to grow, and there's some of it which is valid, and some of it which is plainly fraud, where people are what they call first-person misuse, or someone will try to get a chargeback, get their money back when there was absolutely nothing wrong with their travel. Sometimes it's a matter of degree, because they're unhappy with a part of their travel, but the way the chargeback system works, you have to redo the whole purchase.
Right.
So they'll end up doing a whole $10,000 tour when it was just one hotel. We're also seeing the card issuers are making it very easy to do a chargeback, and I understand why they're doing that. It's good customer service, but also there's almost no friction. You can do a chargeback with one click. There's also very little comeback if you're claiming something maybe you shouldn't be. So the numbers are going up. So what Mint decided to do, particularly for travel agents, is provide a product called Mint Protect, which protects them. There's customers have got travel insurance. They can offload that risk, but travel agents in particular are vulnerable to the chargeback, because say they're making the 10%. When the chargeback happens, they can be responsible for 100% of the cost. When the revenue is only 10%, the profit margin can be 2 or 3%.
Right.
So one bad chargeback around supply delivery can wipe out a month's profit. A supplier failure can wipe out an agency. So what Mint Protect does, it provides coverage in 3 areas. One is card fraud, and we also provide all the kind of tech tools to make sure that doesn't happen. Supplier failure. So we have a big insurance company that insures us to be able to provide that service. But probably the most important is the cases of supplier non-delivery. So that's where a chargeback's happened because of non-delivered or not described, I think is the terms that are used. And we had a classic case recently where a family was traveling with Turkish Airlines to Europe. They lost their pram at the airport. They missed their flight. Turkish, by the terms and conditions of the ticket, cancelled the P&R. They had to rebook all of their flights for the family. It cost $12,000-13,000. They did a chargeback. The card issuer said, yeah, that's unreasonable, but the airline said no. And the agent had that to wear that $12,000. So what Mint Protect does is we help or we work with the agency to kind of fight the chargeback, but we take on responsibility. So we'll do the work, and working with chargeback can take a lot of time. It takes a lot of distraction of a business, and if they lose the case, then we pay. So it's a great tool. Big companies have similar, but they have a lot of insurance behind it, and there's a lot of work. We do it with a small increase on the merchant service fee.
Well, I've certainly seen the stress involved in that, and even the emotional toll that it takes on owners and agents when they're trying to salvage bookings. And they do have those clients, unfortunately, from time to time, and it's the same in any industry. But obviously, it's that much more disconcerting in travel when someone's booked and traveled, and then there's a chargeback, because there's always, are they booked and not traveled? Are they booked and traveled? And and if they have an issue, and then all of a sudden trying to fight a chargeback and having to deal with that is a lot of aggravation beyond just having had someone take a trip, have a great experience. Yeah. This is the sort of thing that people don't focus on until it becomes an issue.
It's incredibly emotional as well, because the travelers generally outraged, rightly or wrongly. The agent has put a lot of work in. They really tried hard, and often in these cases it's not their fault. Even if it is a valid case, it was a supplier or a tour operator that managed that tour, but they're being held responsible. They're being shouted at, and what they need is a business like Mint to stand with them, provide them with technical and operational support and financial support as required.
Well, and I just wanted to talk about the liability and exposure, since when we think about the pandemic reality, STA, Student Travel Alliance, was one of the larger organizations that went under, and they took other partners with them because they had taken the funds and then their accounts were frozen and they went under, and it was a very difficult situation for a lot of different businesses. And obviously, as you mentioned, that could take an agency under depending on their level of exposure. So help us understand, with chargebacks, but specifically the liability, like what is the exposure? Because I think many listeners to this, like this sounds like a pretty good proposition to have Mint Protect someone actually fight this on your behalf, take the hassle out of it for you, and also know that this is not something that could bring your agency down.
Yeah, I mean, if you're using Mint Protect and we're not insurance brokers, so it's not an insurance product. It's a protection product, so you'll pay more on your merchant service fee, but it's a relatively small percentage of that, and effectively we become liable for those costs. So it's a bit like a car accident. We expect our merchants, our partners, to kind of work with us on that case. But if things don't work out as we both plan, then we don't take the money from the merchant. So what generally happens with a chargeback is once a card issuer, a card holder wants to do a chargeback, the card issuer they do cursory checks now on whether this is a valid claim. They will do a chargeback, and then we are required to withdraw the money back from the merchant, from the merchant record, from their bank account, and hold on to it until the case is worked through. Often you've only got a couple of weeks. It takes a while to get to you. Then you've got to provide a lot of evidence, which is hard to do and can take a day out of your week or 2 days. And so what we're doing there is we're not taking the money straight away, because we don't take it because we're liable. So it's important innovation, and as I said, a lot of the large companies do that in house, or they'll do it with an insurance company. But it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of management effort to run something like that. We're providing that for the smaller businesses.
The other thing you mentioned about commissions, obviously we've been discussing that. Supplier payments is another area that travel agents need to prioritize and focus on. So, and I know two areas as I'm preparing for our conversation, supplier payments, commission collection, are two of the most kind of underserved parts of travel. Obviously, there's been a lot of inefficiency there, and for a long time, it's been kind of tolerated. But as people start to look at the flow and the process and the opportunities to improve, what does Mint Payments do on supplier payments that's interesting or unique to make sure that you can reconcile with suppliers? Because obviously I always talk about this in terms of the cash flow and making sure that, a lot of tour operators, the business model for them is, they collect the cash, they hold on to that until they need to pay for the actual services. And there's an opportunity there for making money on both foreign exchange and then interest. So supplier payments, and it's always an issue as far as when you're going to pay suppliers and making sure you're keeping your suppliers happy. So tell us a little bit about that and how that works on the platform.
So we have currently a slightly different platform called Mint EFT in the Australian New Zealand market, and we're doing bringing something similar into the UK. And effectively, it's a platform that a consultant can initiate a payment. It can be integrated into the mid-office platform, so it can happen there from the agent to the supplier. And what will happen is they can make in an agency 10 or 20 payments that day. At the end of the day, the payment is withdrawn by us from their bank account, and it's distributed to all their suppliers. They both get reconciliation reports. So it's integrated. It means that a consultant doesn't have to have access to the online banking, doesn't have to have a company card. The accuracy, the error rate goes down. We have about 1,000 agents on it in the Australian New Zealand market. About 120 big suppliers. It's about a couple of $1 billion in annual transfer. So it's a well-loved platform. and it's all about efficiency. It's all about security. Yeah, it's good.
Well, one thing I want to get into in a moment is AI. And the reason I want to talk about that, obviously, not only is it because it's what everyone wants to hear. Every company is now being forced to highlight their AI strategy and be an AI-first organization. So that's commonly understood. But as a segue into that, I wanted to talk about Mint B2B and what your plans are around that. Because I was just recently at an executive offsite. Actually, it was at the Arrival Valencia conference. And the facilitator was talking about the fact he was just recently doing a offsite for a number of banks in the Middle East, talking about AI and how panicked they are around how customer behavior is changing and what it means for all of their banks and the future of banks in a world where AI is, taking over both the customer journey and the agentic AI with the tools that customers will now have access to. And so it's really forcing banks to reconsider their value proposition, the way they approach technology, even approaching fraud, of course, as well, because that's another big concern as these tools continue to roll out. So tell us a little bit about what your plans are for Mint B2B to make sure that you are modernizing and making sure that you are, meeting, especially supplier payments is a good example, where they need to be today.
Yeah, I think there's two questions there, because I think the Mint B2B is, the plan is there, what we're building out right now is moving from I just described that Mint CFT, it's effectively a one market, one type of payment process. The technology is available now in fintech to do instant global payments at almost no cost, whether that be a kind of a virtual business wallet, whether that be virtual card, Stripe stablecoin. There's all these different opportunities. We've got a network and we're at both ends, so we see a unique opportunity to connect agents and suppliers, and that can be one way. It can also be the other with commission. So they both get great visibility of where the payment is. It's quick, it's easy, it's fast, and it's cheap. Sounds like magic. But the reality is the tech's been there kind of for a while. It's just taking people to plug it together. So I think that's something that we're building now. 2027, we see a big opportunity for that in the travel industry, and that will be a global product. I think that's the key thing. AI, now we're like everyone else. I've probably got the same concerns as everyone else about AI, but I'm a tech optimist. I use it a lot.
I just want to highlight to our listeners too that actually Phil's background, he was a developer with Ruby on Rails at one point. Like, you have a technical background.
Yeah, I took a couple of years out of travel to do that, thinking, how hard is it? It's quite hard. Yeah, is the answer. But yeah, so I'm definitely that tech optimist, and we as a business recognize, that AI can do a lot of good stuff, and it's definitely true that a lot of the people are looking at the front end right now, and particularly people from outside the travel industry. How can AI help people create great itineraries and choose? But for me, the media opportunities is in that plumbing we talked about earlier. The back end is bank reconciliation, it's risk, it's processing. That's what and everyone. A lot of the systems we've had up to now have had to have really clean data and getting it organized. So you talk to businesses about why they don't make those changes. It's because the amount of pre-work they have to do to get the systems ready. Great thing about AI, it's designed to absorb that kind of fuzzy environment. So yeah, it's going to be important to us, and I'm sure it'll be important to our customers.
So a question for you on this, because everyone's talking about how AI is influencing the customer-facing side, and we've certainly seen that with how travelers are embracing AI planning tools. What's really interesting about that, you look at a organization like Focusrite and Mike Coletta, who takes the lead on their AI analysis, and one of the reports that he had delivered just a couple of months ago highlighted that over the last 3 quarters, AI use for travel planning has gone from 30 to 40 to 56%. However, people are not booking through AI because there's still a trust concern, and there will be a breakthrough at some point, and the dam may break where that confidence is there with agentic AI that people will allow these tools to make bookings on their behalf. But obviously that's one of the holdups, and trust is key in that. But I see, and I think most of our listeners also know, that most of the investment in AI has been in the back office and in automation, and so reconciliation, as you mentioned, any repetitive task that will likely disappear in the face of AI. The thing I'd love to ask you, though, is that if we think about being proactive, so trying to prevent disputes or those fraud issues or failed supplier payments, Are there ways that you can leverage AI or planning to leverage AI that will be more proactive in nature to avoid actually having to deal with those negative outcomes?
A poignant question, because we have them. We have customer failure issues that are happening at the moment in multiple markets or at risk. So we've been spending a bit of time, and I was actually spending a couple of hours this morning looking at some data around some of our merchants and looking at how can we help them and understand and help us of the risk of merchant failure. But it's a similar piece around any customer. Is what are those telltales that happen around a customer? Fraud is becoming more prevalent. It's getting smarter. Where people are getting, kicking themselves later when you hear the stories of how they got scammed. So systems that look great. What AI is great at is looking for patterns, and largely it's around that piece. So having a bit of AI, just watching, your transaction flows, looking at bookings, payments of number of people who have cards that are being used multiple times, etc. So there are. I think AI is uniquely suited to that pace.
Well, something that always comes up when we talk about AI is data, and obviously the two go hand in hand. Clean, structured data is obviously essential for AI to function effectively. And as you mentioned, like being able to process mass amounts of data and be able to figure out patterns and signals. For our listeners that are also trying to figure out how clean their data actually is, how important is that from your point of view? With this AI-driven future that we are now facing, and what should they be doing to make sure that they're in a good position to be able to optimize payments and all the information they're collecting on guests? Because the thing that excites me is when you can start to get a better understanding of traveler behavior and who's booking what product at what value with how much lead time. All those things are incredibly important. As you mentioned, there's a lot of cancellations happening. Are they happening 30 days out, 60 days out? Or when people are booking, are they booking for 6 months from now or 12 months from now? How important is it to get an offer out for 2027 now versus do a sale for 2026? So I'd love to know, obviously, it's kind of, I guess, a bit of a two-part question, the importance of how clean and structured the data is, but also the benefits of being able to leverage that data through a payment processing platform like Mint.
Yeah. I think cleaner is better when it comes to data, having structure and normalizing it across pieces. But one of the great things about large language models and AI that we're using today is it is particularly good at dealing with messy data. So previously, change management processes we might want to put in place, people just never got to because the pre-work was too hard. Great thing about AI is surfacing that data is the most important thing, giving it context and providing it into those systems. So I would say, just try and get the data and look at it. Keep human in the loop. So now we're talking a lot more about AI than travel, but keep them in the loop. Don't it still hallucinates and you can make errors there. But payment provides. It is about using. If you're behind on your technology, if you're not automated, if you're not using a good mid office, if you're not using a payment provider which provides you that access to that data, you're kind of locked out. So I think that's the key point. I think from me is choose a partner that has that vision is on that route already.
Well, I'm keen. So you mentioned partners. Obviously, I'm keen to discuss partnerships, but also as far as how the industry is evolving. So there's kind of one last area I wanted to focus on for all of our listeners that I think will be really interesting and important. And it kind of goes back to where our conversation started, which is, from my vantage point, this is the most misunderstood and under-realized opportunity for most travel companies is to really understand their payment processing and make improvements for the sheer benefit initially of just increasing conversions and delighting their guests and then also their partners. Like it's just an integral part of running a successful business. But important is how it's integrated, especially with OTAs, travel management companies, contractors. Like payments sit really at the center of all this activity. And one of the things that payment companies have a really unique view of, and I know this from all the work that I've done with the credit card companies, to your point about the fact most people prefer to pay with credit cards. One of the things that, when you work with Visa or MasterCard or American Express, all of a sudden you can you can better understand your own customers by them presenting back to you what they understand as the signals, especially because they have the vantage point of also understanding other customers for other travel businesses as do you. So not only do you have they currently, the view that they have will be limited to their customer set, but the view that Mint Payments has is across all the travel customers you have. So what I'm keen to know is how you can help your customers, better advance their business and know where things are headed, to be able to say things proactively, to say, wait a second, we're seeing a trend here where people are using buy now, pay later, or people are using alternative forms of payment. Here are some of the things you need to be considering. So I'd love to get your view on that as far as where we're headed in the payment space and where you think the opportunities are.
I think on that use of data, you're absolutely right. As long as we're very careful to protect our cardholders' data, the PII, we have to normalize it and kind of hash it and make sure. But we have got a lot of intelligence, I suppose, or information that we can provide our customers. And Booking.com and Expedia, they're talking to Visa and Master, they're getting all of this. They use this to very fine detail. To our customers, if you've got the right payment service provider, talk to them. We can provide you with broader range of just about you, where you sit in the data set, where you sit in the competitors, lead times changing, etc. So we've got a lot of data available. We're doing more in that space to provide more broader information. You've got to be careful. There's a security and there's a lot of oversight on data. We have our head of risk is very strong on what we are allowed to do. I think the payments is not utilized strongly enough. People spend a lot of time looking in websites using the Google Analytics, looking at the CRMs, trying to use demographics. But there's this massive piece of data around payments. And yes, we can see, some of the most payment providers now, the big ones who we partner with, something like 96% of all cards will go through them once a year. So the visibility is huge. Bit scary, but useful if done right. So I think work with take payments seriously, put it up front, make it part of your growth strategy rather than just the way you take money at the end. It's money, it's a bit icky. We don't like to talk about it. It's a way of serving your customers better. It's a way of growing your business. It's a way of improving the service that you provide.
Well, and I'll just share this too, because I think it'll be interesting for our listeners, because one of the projects that I was responsible for many years at the Travel Corporation was this concept of the 10-year wallet. Mm-hmm. And the simple explanation of that was, how do you make sure that you are meeting the customer for all their travel needs over a 10-year span? And so building repeat business and having a better view of what other products you can put in front of the customer, and also increasing terms we'll use like basket size or like that, and a good example of that too is travel insurance. Some companies, they don't even necessarily know what good looks like in terms of, 20% of their customers buy travel insurance. Is it 50%? Some companies it might be 90%. So, what does good look like? And obviously you have that vantage point. So I think there's a lot here. And I'm when we close in a moment, obviously I'm keen to make sure that our listeners know the reports and various other ways they can see, what Mint Payments is tracking, other things they can learn. But before we do that, partnerships. I really want to get into that, especially as we are focusing on the Canadian market and partnerships in the travel industry. Relationships are important, as we all know. Partnerships are critical to success. Yeah. And, you've obviously got a great infrastructure in place and existing partners. When it comes to the Canadian market, obviously I'm assuming it's going to be important for you when it comes to partners. I'm sure many people will reach out to you after listening to this podcast. But how important do you see them being here in the Canadian market? And when people are thinking about how they might reach out to you and to be able to collaborate with Mint, I'm keen for obviously make sure that people know how best to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious answer is partnerships are super critical. I used to run partnerships for Mint before I did my current role, and we've got a partnership manager in Australia, New Zealand. We have another one in the UK, and I'm sure we'll be employing one in North America soon. So something like 90% of our 95, I think it was, percent of our transactions come through a partner. Whether that be through a consortium or a host agency, it's probably called here, or it's a tech platform. So, without them, we don't have a business. It's how we distribute our product. It's how our customers interact with us through the trade group or the technology provider. So, as we enter a market, I've spent the week. I've been meeting host agency groups, tech providers, both on the agency side and supplier side, and building those relationships. And that's how we will work. And I think that's something we understand at Mint about travel. It's the way the business works.
Yeah, well, obviously, and any of our listeners understand those terms you mentioned about host agencies and consortium. It's interesting when you mentioned that because there is terminology that is a little different in different markets.
I'm learning.
Yeah, and the host agencies is incredibly important to the North American market and the Canadian market. I mean, if you look at one example, Travel Agent Next Door, which is a $500 million plus. It was recently bought by Travel Counselors. My good friend Jeff Element is now the COO over there, and it just highlights just how big travel advisors are, the importance. And so when you are now focusing on the Canadian market, I know you've been traveling across the country on this trip. You've been in Vancouver and Calgary and Toronto. What types of partners are you looking to collaborate with? What is kind of as people are listening to this and saying, wait a second, because we'll have advisors who are listening to this who are part of a host agency, and ultimately it's up to the host agency to make the decision before it will cascade down to that travel advisor. And with Travel Agent Next Door, for example, I know that they review partners like every 2 years, and this is where sometimes our industry moves a bit more slowly than we'd want it to.
Of course.
So what type of partners are you looking to collaborate with here in Canada as Mint Travel grows?
Yeah, I mean, the three main groups are the host agencies, which wasn't new when we started working in Canada. It's a new word. We can call them consortia or something else in other markets, but essentially the same function. And, we spoke to Jeff and et cetera, and kind of talking to the different groups. So definitely the host agencies. But agents, just reach out if they've got any questions for me. They want to know a bit more about Mint. Sometimes it's good to a bottom-up approach when building a business. Tech providers, so we're again talking to those, and this is another thing that's got lots of different names, but I just generally call them mid offices. Yep. So the agency platforms, the Reserve X's and Trays, etc. of the world, and Travcom is actually we're already a partner with Travcom. I know that's used quite a lot in this market, and suppliers. I suppose just the tour operators, etc., and wholesalers that we work with in other markets. And a lot of those we already have relationships with, so it's about extending them to this market. But anyone that wants to talk to me, please.
Well, and obviously I mentioned at the beginning, mintpayments.com. Obviously you're very active on LinkedIn as well, as I know. I do have two final questions for you, but just on this topic, if people do want to reach out, what would be the best ways to do that with either you or the rest of the team?
Send it to me. I'm happy that Philip.Hancock is 1L .Hancock at mintpayments.com, or you can send it to many of the other ones, sales at mintpayments.com. But I don't want it to, they often kind of get into some bucket somewhere. So send me an email. I'm on LinkedIn. Just reach out. We've got some guys on the ground here as well supporting us, and teams in Sydney and in London. So we'll make the time zone work until we have the team grown in this market.
That's great. Let's fill up Phil's inbox. And so, but two last questions for you. One about the industry and one more personal and travel and your plans is that if you could snap your fingers and overnight change one thing about how travel payments work globally, just out of curiosity, what might that be?
Fraud probably is because it just doesn't. I suppose it's crime, but and it's a purely negative thing. It doesn't add any kind of value. So if we can get rid of fraud, and I think it's one of those things that is now becoming more important in travel, and we're getting better at it. So I think we're going through a bit of a point in the moment where but otherwise it's. It sounds obvious from a payments person, but take payments, put it up front, think about it more, think about how your customers. It's a growth tool, not just a cost.
Yeah, and I know you're going to be spending a lot more time in Canada, and I love traveling to Australia. So either I'm going to see you in Australia next, or next time you're back across in Canada, and obviously our paths may cross at other global conferences as well, given the whole global profile of Mint Payments and everything you guys are working across. Given the focus on the Canadian market and the fact you're going to be spending more time here. Now, and I don't want to exclude anybody, but I was just because at Rendezvous yesterday, and from coast to coast to coast, obviously you got the East Coast, you got Quebec, Ontario, you've got the Prairies, you've got British Columbia, Alberta, and now all of a sudden there's been a big focus. I asked a number of the executives on the event Spotlight yesterday where they were going to travel to next, and almost everyone said the Arctic. There was either Nunavut or Yukon or Northwest Territories. So Phil, if we could send you somewhere else in Canada that you'd be keen to explore to enjoy an extra week next time you're across here for business, where might you be interested in going?
It's a loaded question, but I think, look, being in Australia, I've been to the West Coast a bit more. It's more accessible, and Vancouver's a lovely city. Toronto is a real hub, and I spent some time in Calgary, which I haven't done before, which is nice. But I think for me, it might be the Maritimes up in the northeast, up in Prince Edward Island or somewhere around there.
Yeah, my daughter's at school in Halifax at Dalhousie, and she loves the East Coast. My sister lives out there, and for a lot of people from the UK, they come to PEI in the summertime. Newfoundland, of course. So yeah, you definitely have to, and you're not going to offend any Canadians by saying you need to go to the East Coast. If anyone, it's the salt of the earth. Those are, you definitely need to get out to the East Coast on a future trip.
It's a bit of a trek from Sydney, but I think it's where we want to take my family there. I think my wife and daughter would love it. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. You definitely need to add that for future plans. And so make sure when you're reaching out to Phil, give him a few suggestions of things he should do when he's on the East Coast of Canada, because as you all know, there's so many amazing gems to experience on the East Coast. But Phil, it's been great getting this time. Obviously, I'm thrilled that you have decided to come to Canada, and we've made this time to get together live in person to be able to record this. Obviously, I wish you and the team every success with the launch and the rollout, and I look forward to keeping in touch. And thanks again for joining us for this special Spotlight episode.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be able to kind of talk to the sexy end of travel, the payment side, and I've appreciated this time with you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.